In today's video, Christy Lefteri's new novel, The Book of Fire, radical empathy when a mother offers her daughter's killer a place to stay, violence in Ireland in Michael Magee's Close to Home, Bryan Washington's new novel about a man suffering from the death of his husband, family meal, the big novel out from Georgia right now, Hard by the Great Forest, descendants of slaves get a large cash payment in acts of forgiveness, Kiley Reid's follow-up to Such a Fun Age, a Belgium literary dystopian classic, I Who Have Never Known Men, an Indigenous child is kidnapped and raised by white parents, Alba de Cespedes' Italian classic Forbidden Notebook, Is It Prostitution? Sugar Baby by Celine Saintclare, Eliza Clark writes one very scary lady in boy parts, Charlotte Wood looks at religion and forgiveness in Stoneyard Devotional, and Things We Didn't Know by Elba Iris Perez. Hi, I'm Scott. Welcome back to Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, a channel where I discuss literary fictions, new releases, and global literature. I am extra excited to talk about this collection of books to you today. Some are good, some are not so good, but the last two books are going to be in my top 10 books of the year. And the last one, I don't like to call it this early. There's still a lot of reading to come. But well, let's put it this way. I'll be overjoyed if I read a better book than it. I've got a lot to get through, so let's crack on with it. And I'm going to start with the books I didn't like enough to finish, and we're going to go from worst to best. Come and Get It by Kiley Reid. I know some people hated Such a Fun Age, but I loved it. 5 stars, brilliant book. So I expected to at minimum like this book, but it was so boring. I gave up a third of the way in. By this point, no plot was set up, no tension was set up, no interesting themes were set up, the characters were beige. The only difference between reading this and a back of a cereal box is that you can finish a cereal box in 5 minutes. I think some of you might be asking me, but Scott, aren't you going to tell me what this book is about? And that's the same question I would like to ask Kiley Reid. From the reviews I see around, DNFing Come and Get It is a pretty uncontroversial point of view. But DNFing this next book, that might surprise a few people. Hard by the Great Forest by Vardiashvili. This book is getting compared to Khaled Hosseini, but I think Dan Brown is more accurate. Saba, a Georgian Englishman, returns to Georgia after his father and brother went there and then disappeared. For some reason that clearly makes sense to the author, the brother leaves a bunch of clues behind for this man to follow. He couldn't be bothered to email him more detail, but he can set up a bunch of esoteric clues. The puzzles, they're not really solvable for the reader. It's like reading that hack Victorian detective that everybody loves. I fully expected at some point Saba would just say, "Cigarette ash, I've solved the case." Which would have been weird because this doofus didn't even know the difference between a hippo and a rhino. This book suffers from not bothering to world build. If you want to write successful C-grade adventure novels, you still need to world build. But this novel isn't trying to be an adventure novel. Saba's exploration of Georgia is intended to be a discussion of the effects of war and poverty on the region and to show us Georgia in all of its glory and corruption, in which case you still need to world build. But this book just lacks the internal logic to make it work. It is deeply flawed because the author couldn't be bothered world building. How can you write a book about Georgia and not include Georgia in it? This is the literary fiction man on a journey novel. You know, the kind of novel where the author thinks he has more interesting stuff to say than the humans he's writing about or the story he's telling. And I mean, if that's the case, just write a non-fiction. Just write a non-fiction and don't bother masturbating on a page. The House of Plain Truth by Donna Hemans. Perline's father dies. On his deathbed, he asks Perline to find them, but expires before he can pass on any further details. As Perline investigates, she finds that he didn't own his home, but there's a potential secret past. She goes from Brooklyn to Jamaica to Cuba to uncover her family's secrets. This is a significantly better book than the last 2 books I DNF'd. If this story happened to my friend, my wife, to, a fellow booktuber or something like that, it would be a really interesting story. But it's not happening to them. It's happening to Perline, and I'm not invested in Perline at the beginning of this book. I don't care about her and her family. Hemans just needed to do something to endear her to me, to make me care about her family's secrets. But a bit past halfway in this novel, and I was sort of like, why am I reading this? What do I even want to have happened? I hadn't developed any positive or negative feelings towards Pearline. She just wasn't interesting. And that's a very hard situation for a book to come back from. DNF's over. Time to talk about the books I've finished. And I don't have any books that I would consider bad. But I do have quite a few books that would fit into the category of I enjoyed them because I like reading and stories and characters and all of those things. And the books are quite competently written. I was getting stuff out of them. But if I had a time machine, I would probably redirect me towards other books because there are better reads. Family Meal by Bryan Washington. Cam is mourning the death of Kai and their life in LA, but then decides to move back to Houston where his childhood best friend TJ lives. TJ's family owns a bakery, which plays a massive role in this novel. Cam is self-destructive. He is dealing with an eating disorder, and he is addictively meeting people on Grindr. There are quite a few side characters in this, and I think Washington really struggles with character development because of that. There was like the correct amount of character development in this novel, but it was spread too thinly across too many characters. Intellectually, I knew what Cam was going through, but I felt like I was a bit distant from him. There was just that lack of vulnerability in this novel. It's not to say that it wasn't there, but it just wasn't there enough. And it's not to say that this is a bad book by any means. But Washington is writing about grief, friendship, rebirth, a miserable book with a happy ending and all of the feelings along the way. And that's a book I will just about always read. I will always enjoy. But yet, this is kind of forgettable and it really fails to stand out. The eating disorder was hardly explored or discussed at all, and Washington even employs Cam in a bakery. I mean, it's the perfect situation. I needed that little bit more meat there to digest, to chew upon. It is not a bad book by any means, but I was just really disappointed by what this book could have been and what it failed to be. How to Kidnap the Rich by Rahul Raina. Look, let's be honest, there's a fair bit wrong with this book. The biggest flaw for me is that it starts with a line, "The first kidnapping wasn't my fault. The others, those were definitely me." Good title, great first line. The only problem is there's only actually one kidnapping in this book. It's like me saying, the first time Australia lost the war against emus, it wasn't my fault. All the other times it was. Except that Australia's only ever lost one war against those devil birds. So it's a bit of a misleading statement. It's also listed as a crime thriller mystery novel. I mean, I get it. I guess that's technically correct. But it's a comedy. It's one of those comedies that tells a lot of jokes. They're not always funny, but because they tell so many jokes, you basically are always going to have a laugh because statistics. And I'm happy to tolerate a bad joke for a good joke. And if you are too, then this book will make you laugh. Ramesh works as a tutor, and by tutor I mean he takes Year 12's tests for his students every year, securing their future. After a few years of doing this, he's gotten particularly good, and when he takes the tests for Rudy, he accidentally places first in all of India, gaining Rudy instant overnight celebrity status. Due to a collection of farces, Ramesh becomes Rudy's manager, landing him a role on a game show. This all leads to some sort of kidnapping, which frankly isn't the biggest plot hole in this novel. This captures both the hustle nature and the silliness of a novel such as The White Tiger, without having many of the literary merits of that novel. This is a fun read, this is a good time, but it's not exactly a good novel. Things We Didn't Know by Elba Iris Perez. This is a Puerto Rican novel based in both Puerto Rico and Massachusetts. Andrea and Pablo, brother and sister. And we follow Andrea, who is 9 when this all begins, living with their parents in Massachusetts with their mother and father during the 1950s. As cracks in their parents' marriage begins to develop, the pair are rushed to Puerto Rico with family they don't remember meeting, only to return to Massachusetts later in the book. Neither a mother or father are perfect, although one parent is significantly better than the other parent. What has been explored here is the idea of the outsider. What Andrea and Pablo are frequently told is their auntie presents as a man and is very clearly a trans-masculine person. Stigma exists around them. Questions of whether they're appropriate to look after the children are raised, which is quite laughable when you consider the job they do raising the children versus anybody else. Similarly, we see while they're in Puerto Rico, Andrea and Pablo feel too American or too English-speaking compared to the other children. Once they're back in Massachusetts, they're too Puerto Rican, they're too foreign. One of the things I quite liked in this novel was the exploration of racism towards black people within the Puerto Rican community. I loved that Andrea was thinking, they might be darker than us, but to a white person, we all might as well be black, so it makes no sense for us to go on hating black people. Things like this are not only utilised to discuss racism, but also to demonstrate the generational differences between parents and children. The more tolerant youth disagreeing with the elders, and in this case, clearly very wrong generation above them. The novel, however, just is lacking in a little bit of subtlety and nuance. I found quite a lot of things turned up. Some were just a little bit too black and white, not explored as much as I would have liked. I think Perez maybe needs to trust her readers 10% more. There were quite a few times where she just left breadcrumbs for you to follow and then circled back and stuck in a signpost. An interesting book, but maybe a few cuts could have gotten rid of the hand-holding and made it flow nicer. Close to Home by Michael Magee. Set in Belfast, we follow Sean, who, having done almost everything he's meant to do, work hard, study, stay out of trouble. He returns from university only to find that there are no jobs. His friends are all doing exactly the same gear they were doing when he left. And then an act of violence sucks him back into the life he worked so hard to avoid. This is really a novel about class, violence, stigma, and the situation in Northern Ireland, which is pretty translatable to other lower socioeconomic places with a culture of drugs and violence. The setting and the hopelessness that is part of the culture Sean and his friends have, that came through really strongly, even to the point of how he interacted with Reid, his romantic interest. There was a hopelessness in their relationship, even though they grew up together, even though they're cut from the same cloth, because she is still planning to leave and he has returned. It's like he doesn't believe he is good enough for her, and she doesn't really want him because she is going and doesn't want to invest. But also, Sean just kind of expects to fall into a relationship with her. And that is the strengths and the weaknesses of the book right there. I found Sean a difficult character to relate to. He made bad choices, he made good choices, but I never really knew why he was making the choices he made. He just sort of drifted and lacked agency in his own life. And look, I've been guilty of doing that, so I do understand that. But I just don't know some of the justifications he had for the actions he took. It's a very difficult character to suck you into. I'm almost a little confused. Is Magee saying the situation is hopeless, or is he saying the situation is Sean's own making? Of course, Magee is just describing the situation, describing the character. This isn't a vessel for his political beliefs. So you're left with a vision of how Sean could get out, but also how easy it is for him to get sucked back down, how hard it is for him to get out. It is not impossible, but it is unreasonably hard, and it does require luck, self-belief, and determination, all three of which are lacking from Sean as a character. This one for me is a bit of a mixed bag. I think for me it suffered from me having quite high expectations because it's an Irish novel that has been well hyped over the last 12 months. And I mean, you look at the last 12 months, to be a hyped Irish novel means you have to be special. And this wasn't special. This was just a good book. Christy Lefteri's The Book of Fire. Set on a Greek island where a fire burns down the lives of several of the villagers. Most of the book is set approximately 2 months after the fire, where we follow survivor Irini, who is going about rebuilding her life. One day while out for a walk, Irini comes across the man who started the fire. The man is dying. Of what? She is unsure. But in a split second, Irini makes a choice out of anger, a choice she will regret. While the fire in this novel is making comments on climate change, and there are definitely climate fiction elements to this book, what this book is more about is society and culture. It's about going against the group or along with the group. As we learn what the man who started the fire was dying of when Irini finds him, as we learn if she is in trouble, as we learn if she will help the police investigate his death or hold other people's secrets, we discover a society who, pushed by extreme anger and loss, will look the other way. The book asks questions like, where does good end and evil begin? How does society affect human nature? And how does society treat a person it deems as an outsider? Is this a good book? Absolutely. Is this a memorable book? No. This is the sort of book that it would be very, very easy for me to give a good review of. But the truth is, it's a mixed book. There are some really interesting themes and ideas in this book. It would make a great conversation starter for a book club. But as a standalone read, I find it somewhat lacking. It is not quite sure if it wants to be commercial or literary. Everything was done to an acceptable level, but I wanted a little bit more density in the ideas, in the character development, and in the plot. And as I say, the market for this book is for book clubs or for buddy reads if you're looking for a good conversation starter. The Berry Pickers by Amanda Peters. A Micmac family from Nova Scotia arrives in Maine in July 1962 to pick blueberries for the summer. And while there, 4-year-old Ruthie vanishes. Ruthie's older brother, Joe, was affected by the loss of his sister, and it will haunt him for years to come. Norma grows up the only child of an upper-middle-class Maine family. Her father is distant, and her mother refuses to talk about certain topics, citing headaches as soon as questions are asked. Overly protected, Norma is not allowed out to play with other children, but as she grows up, she starts to realise things. For example, her skin begins to go brown in the sun while her family stays white. We go back and forth between Joe and Norma. We witness key events in their life as they progress into adulthood. Joe struggles with depression, identity issues, alcoholism, and situational violence. Norma develops a better relationship with her auntie than her parents. She struggles with a choice around if she should have children or not, and the impact that that has upon her life. Look, my viewers are not stupid. You all know that Norma and Ruthie are the same person. I'm obviously neither American or Canadian, you can tell from my accent. I'm not very well educated on the treatment of Indigenous populations in those two countries, but I do know they're particularly badly treated historically, and I do know about things like the 60s scoop, and I imagine that they are very similar to Australia's treatment of our Indigenous population, which is appalling. What I think Peters is doing is exploring the idea that Indigenous children were better raised by white families. And even though Norma or Ruthie is a clearly better adjusted human than Joe, it is her disappearance that triggered a lot of Joe's issues. And Peters is not arguing that Indigenous people make better parents than white people. She's not arguing the opposite either. The privileges Norma has as a result of her adoptive parents/kidnappers definitely do give her advantages. But as parents, they are missing the warmth that her biological mother has for her children. They are, in short, different parents with different pros and cons. But what remains is the breaking of a people, the effect on the remaining children and parents that the taking of this child has, the effects on a community that the removal of one person has. On the negative side of things, Norma was just a better built character than Jo, and it made her sections by far superior. From a writing point of view, it is very interesting to see the difference a good character makes to the overall quality of a novel, away from other factors. The plot was a little too slow, and there were questions and choices that needed a little bit more justification for me, particularly Norma's realization that her parents were not actually her parents, and then not talking about them, only to have it come out years later in the line, "I've known I've been adopted for years." I know that this is actually a normal process for children that were adopted, but it's not the only response that they can have, and it would have been fabulous to get Norma's thoughts on that, rather than just have it come out years later. I think very few people will actively dislike this book, but there are some small flaws with big impacts. And that kind of makes me excited to read what Amanda Peters will write next. A promising but flawed debut novel. This is the first of 3 Gunpowder Fiction and Plot book club picks I'm going to discuss in this video, so it is a great point to thank my Patreons for their support. I would like to welcome my newest Patreons, Patty, Julie, Marilyn, Taig, Mandy, Isabel, Rita, and Stephanie, all who have signed up in the last month. I feel quite lucky and quite blessed and supported to have so many of you join recently. It's actually really moving, and if I wasn't dead inside, I may be a little bit teary right now. Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood. This is quite a strange atmospheric book about a woman who abandons her city life and her marriage and lives essentially as a nun in a small religious community near her hometown. Religion as a concept isn't really the point of this novel. It's not interested in discussing the role of, say, God or the afterlife. Our protagonist doesn't even believe in God. But what this book is interested in is the spiritual existence, in the role of the church on the here and now, in the cloister as an institution. It's about women, a simple life, and most importantly, it is about forgiveness. Radical forgiveness is the central theme of this novel. And as in this video we transition from the average books into the good books, this is the first of 3 books of which forgiveness is a major theme. This is a slow-paced novel that is deeply reflective. The novel centres around 3 events: a visitor to the monastery, a nun who our protagonist remembers from high school, a girl who was bullied relentlessly, a woman who has become a bit of a rock star activist nun. At first, our protagonist is worried she will be recognised, and then she is worried that she is not recognised. When she seeks forgiveness, who is she seeking forgiveness from? Is she asking forgiveness from the nun, or is she seeking forgiveness from herself for actions she is no longer proud of? And is the casual indifference of the activist nun a case of passive aggression, or is it indeed an act of forgiveness, or just the action of a woman who, having spent most of her life fighting for human rights, protesting and getting arrested, experiencing injustice, is this the action of a woman who no longer considers the bullying a significant event in her past? The activist nun's stay at the monastery is extended due to COVID and lockdown, but this is not a lockdown novel in any way. The second event is a biblical plague of mice. Now, I have said this novel is quite a reflective novel focused on interpersonal relationship and forgiveness, but such is the depth of my hatred and disgust towards mice. I think it is more accurate to say that I was reading a horror novel. I'm probably the only person in the world to find this novel more disturbing and legitimately creepy than novels such as May Fly or Tender as the Flesh. To be honest, such is my phobia of those foul rodents that I have no idea why it was included in the novel, and I can only assume that it was somehow significant. But the only thought it created deep inside me was, drop a brick on them. The last event is the return of a deceased nun's bone to the monastery from Thailand, after she disappeared and is assumed murdered. One of the sisters who knew her spends countless hours in the room the body will be relocated to, praying. Once you discover the reasons for this, and I will not go into detail because I feel like it's a spoiler, but I think that if you have read it, you know that those reasons, I think there's such a smart and intelligent way of adding to the discussions around forgiveness that this novel was having. I also think that the return of Bones to the monastery is a not so subtle and quite powerful discussion of feminism and women's rights, which were also major themes throughout the novel. This is not the type of book to have a story arc or a captivating plot, and while it is a solid good book, I don't feel like it was quite strong enough in the other areas to get away without a simple plot. It is a very one-dimensional novel, which means I expect it to be a bit of a love it or hate it book, but curiously I've landed in the middle, liking it but not adoring it. Sugar Baby by Celine Saintclare. Agnes is 21, young, beautiful, mixed race. She works as a cleaner, making what a cleaner makes. Then she meets Emily, who is a model with a more than lucrative side gig dating sugar daddies, and Agnes is slowly seduced into the lifestyle. This is kind of a fictional tell-all, messy girl novel that blurs a lot of lines. Just because it's transactional doesn't mean that Agnes doesn't have feelings. Just because she's a sugar babe doesn't mean she's also a prostitute. Just because one client is safe doesn't mean they all are. Sex workers come in a lot of varieties and flavours, and I'm not sure if Agnes is a sex worker or not. I'm not sure Agnes knows if she is either. She starts off just being paid to have a date with somebody. Regardless of the technicalities, that doesn't feel like sex work to me. We've all had lunch with people we've hoped would give us money. Job interviews, clients, networking, corporate bullshit. Agnes doesn't see the slippery slope. She is young, and she thinks she's using her looks and youth to make the system work. But is she making the system work for her, or is she the one being worked? This novel was kind of a car crash, one that you can't stop looking at. It's kind of great because it's a world that we all know exists, but I don't know if other people are well apprised of it, but I know very little about it. I thought the characterization of Agnes was quite well done. But where I thought this novel could have been improved is that it didn't make me worry about Agnes in the sticky situations. She was friends with other sugar babes, and comments about bruises on one of their legs after a night out, I thought, well, that's interesting foreshadowing. But it wasn't quite followed. And we were kept in doubt. Was this woman tolerating being hit for the money? There were also quite a few situations that were just plain dangerous intellectually, but the tension didn't come through. And it's so weird because the seduction of the lifestyle, the jealousy Agnes felt towards her sugar daddy's wives, the satisfaction she felt over the power of sex she had on these men, and the confused naivety of her all came through brilliantly. It was like Celine Saintclare could write all emotions but fear. I get the feeling that this is very autobiographical too, but I wonder if the author had a lucky life and wanted to include just a hint of the darker stuff that she knew about. It is being compared to Luster, and it's a comparison that I think really works. I'd say that I think Luster was the better novel, but I know it's a bit of a love it or hate it novel, and I'm definitely in the love it camp, so maybe this one will work for you. Overall, a very good, but a flawed book. Quinn by Em Strang. Quinn is in prison. He is convinced he didn't kill his childhood friend Andrea. He is convinced he will soon be cleared. As his parole hearing nears, he receives an interesting invitation. Andrea's mother has invited Quinn to live with her. Let's clear something up. She does not believe Quinn is innocent. She has sent Quinn many letters abusing him, but now she is offering him an olive branch in a time of great need. Once freed, Quinn has nowhere to live, nowhere to stay, so he will stay with Andrea's mother. This intense radical act of forgiveness isn't as straightforward as it sounds. Andrea's mother needs help. In her age, she is no longer capable of looking after herself. The two share a delicately balanced and tense relationship which explores guilt, forgiveness, debt, ingratitude, desperation, and judgment. This is a debut novel from a Scottish poet, and I found her prose very effective, creating that sense of confusion Quinn felt towards the death of his friend, and yet not confusing the reader. and I'm not really sure how Strang did it. This book is only 200 odd pages long, and I really could have used with a little bit more fleshing out. It is not a perfect novel, but I found it addictive. The relationships in this novel, the question of, did Quinn murder Andrea? What is Andrea's mother up to? The stigma around the people who have gone to jail, all of this made it such an intriguing read, and I enjoyed the exploration of all of that. Acts of forgiveness. Maura cheeks. What if every person in the United States of America who can prove that they are the descendants of slaves could claim up to $175,000? It is such an interesting way to consider race and privilege. Money doesn't really feel like a solution to racism. I mean, it's not, but it really would address some of the disadvantages that growing up black has. In Acts of Forgiveness, we follow Willie, a single black mother who has given up a promising and beloved journalism career a decade ago to move home to help her father's failing construction business. As much of this book is about the theoretical world where this act of forgiveness is being debated in US Parliament, it is also about the life of this one lady, a lady with a love for writing and digging up the truth. We see through Willie's eyes the racism that this debate creates and how it is exacerbated when the bill is eventually passed. I love the exploration of the issues around this bill. So far, I have intentionally conflated black and the descendants of slaves, and while that is true for a high number of black people, they are not the same populations. If Willie wants her $175,000, she needs to prove that she is indeed the descendants of slaves, but her mother is adopted, she doesn't know her history, and her father is not so keen on her to track down his family history and dig up the past. Willie is in a position where the money would really help her, but paradoxically, where she also has enough money to take a trip to the south, to go to public libraries and records and construct a family genealogy that proves that there is slavery in her lineage. And I think that is a wonderful way of demonstrating the practical limitations of this hypothetical bill. What a wonderful way of showing the differences and the overlap of financial and racial disadvantages. It is a perfect example of dystopian writing in a book that is not dystopian at all. Ultimately, it feels like everything in this book is discussing privilege and disadvantage. It is not all racial. Some of it is gendered. Some of it is about location. But it is a very linked book. It is very clever and very thought-provoking. Forbidden Notebook by Alba de Cespedes, translated from Italian by Ann Goldstein. This 1952 Italian classic was only translated into English last year. It centers Valeria, who convinces a tobacconist to sell her a notebook on a Sunday. At the time, tobacconists were only allowed to sell tobacco on a Sunday due to regulations to do with jealous newsagents who weren't allowed to trade on Sundays. Hence the notebook is very literally forbidden. In it, she journals her thoughts and keeps it hidden from her family. She is married with 2 almost adult children. The relationship she has with her daughter is fascinating. She herself is unhappy with her lot in life. She is unhappy with the role of women. She pushes against it. But as she pushes against it, her daughter hits it with a hammer. She flat out disregards it and willfully does what she wants. And instead of embracing her, Valeria becomes the force to keep her in line. She pits herself against her daughter. It's not just hypocritical. Valeria is doing many of the same things that Morella is doing. It's also jealousy, except that we don't see it as jealousy because we're only getting Valeria's point of view. It is a really simple but a lovely way of showing us a very subtly unreliable narrator. One who is maybe not lying, but maybe presenting the truth with a slight slant. This is a fantastic portrait of Valeria. The difference in treatment of her son to her daughter. The treatment of her son's new girlfriend. It produces a fascinating critique of the women of the 1950s. Women that were not happy, seemingly stuck in both the pre- and post-women's right movement. Working a job and doing the housework, complaining yet not accepting help, recognizing that life is unfair yet perpetuating that imbalance, calling people out, for essentially their own actions. This novel is deceptively simple. It's a novel that when you consider it, it continues to develop, gradually improving as you place together the pieces. This was a Patreon pick for my book club, and I was so happy we got to discuss this book afterwards. If I were to rank this book going into that meeting, it would have been considerably earlier in this video. But as we discussed it, as I listened to other people's ideas and opinions, I learnt some of the hidden depth that other people saw, and the ideas percolated in my brain, and it continued to percolate after that meeting. A very intelligent piece of writing, and I must see what Elba de Cespedes has written, and if anything else has been translated into English. Only 2 books left, and these 2 books are quite simply exceptional. These are probably the 2 best books I've read all year. I, Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman, translated from French by Ros Schwartz. 39 women and 1 girl are locked in a cage together. They don't know why. Their guards, who are all men, don't tell them. They have no notion of time. They are provided with meagre ration. The 39 women remember life before the cage. The girl does not. Violence of any type is met with whips. The women are not allowed to fight, to administer self-harm, or to do anything really. And let me ask you the question you will undoubtedly be asking yourself when you begin reading this book. Why are they there? What Harpman has done is absolutely brilliant, because as you ponder this question, as you come up with theories to it, the book morphs and changes around your own ideas. And that is extended to the point of genre. What genre is this book even? The thing is, if you're looking for a literary fiction interpretation, it's there. If you're looking for a full-on science fiction interpretation, it's there. Fantasy, feminist, coming-of-age, dystopian, horror, mystery, LGBT. There's even elements of thriller and romance in this book. Ask yourself the question, are they on Earth? And you're in a science fiction novel. Ask yourself the question, what is the relationship between these women? Suddenly you're reading literary fiction. The thing is, Jacqueline Harpman has actually put enough in this book to do it all. I've read thousands of books. Never have I read a book like this. Flat out, if you don't like this book, quit reading and take up golf. I'm sorry, that was really harsh. I don't wish golf on anybody. That's proper 8th circle of hell stuff. Honestly, this is a book that I can't see anybody not liking. So as I've said that everybody has a unique experience reading this book depending on who they are. What did I take out of this book? Look, there's a lot, so I'll just discuss some things. If you would like me to do a standalone review of this book, that's definitely something I would consider. As this girl ages and develops, it becomes clear that the women were keeping secrets from her. This is not some kind of mystery. They were secrets such as, where do babies come from? What is sex like? You could look at this as a kindness. She has spent her entire life locked in a prison with only 39 other women. She is never likely to have sex with a man or to make a baby, so why tell her about it? But I didn't see it that way. Even when these women were reduced to nothing, they would still try and trade. They would still try and have something over other people. I don't think that they were keeping the secrets as a kindness, but as power. It is fundamental to our human nature. And we see it again in the girl as she picks one of the guards and continues to look at him exclusively. Any form of reaction from this particular guard towards her is a form of power. It demonstrates that she has influenced him. It is also, in a very basic form, a human connection. The desire for human connection is so central to this book. We begin to see these women who were heterosexuals or at least had children and husbands before they were locked in a cage. We see them form queer or lesbian attachments. It is saying that the human desire for connection and intimacy is more important and fundamental than our sexuality. It is arguing that sexuality is a construct of the society in which we live. And actually, if you take gender out of it, it's really obvious. We can only have preferences to things in our society. Nobody is saying that they want to date somebody with blue skin because nobody has blue skin in our world. But in a world where blue skin were common, people might only date people with blue skin. And in a world without men, women would only date women. Sexuality is a construct and we all seek power over other people. But I have no idea why they were locked in a cage. It is fascinating how the hook, which is a very effective hook, suddenly becomes the least interesting thing about the novel, as our brain explores all the possibilities of this world. This was another book I read as part of my Patreon book club, and I think that this is the perfect book club novel as well. So many people said things that had never crossed my mind. The things that people were sharing were just so enriching to my experience too. And while I love my Patreons and think that they're all super intelligent and interesting people, it really is a testament to the book that it can spark so many different ideas in different readers. And then any conversation with somebody else will enrich your experience of it. If you run a book club, I really recommend picking this book. In any logical world, that would have been the best book I have read so far this year. But I have read something that I think is one of the best books I have ever read. Let's talk about Boy Parts by Eliza Clark. This is a dark and disturbing book for fans of Sayaka Murata's Earthlings, or no, I can't think of another book that is both amazing and carries such a level of dark and disturbing. It's a kind of gender-flipped American Psycho, except that that book is trash and this book is amazing. If you thought Eileen by Atessa Moshfegh was just a bit too nice and wholesome, you might enjoy this book. Irina is a very tall, Geordie photographer with an eating disorder, a voluptuous drug habit, and clearly considerably better than average looks. She takes explicit photos of average-looking men she meets and scouts from the street. Irina is a textbook unreliable narrator, hoovering down illicit substances and alcohol. She is full of feminist rage. Actually, there's a considerable amount of non-specific rage inside her too. She is a large woman, and this is important, and please don't misunderstand me that I am saying she's fat. What I am trying to say is that she possesses considerable strength. At one point, Irina spits out in frustration the line, "What will it take for somebody to see me as a threat?" And it kind of seems fitting that I felt the need to spend so much time essentially saying that if this bitch punches you, you're going to break something. Irina becomes obsessed with a shy man working at her local supermarket. He is 5'5", some 8 inches shorter than Irina, and becomes the latest model for her. Irina becomes quite sexually obsessed with this man, and while a lot of Irina's models think the invitation to model for her is just a chance to fuck her, this man appears to be interested in her as a human being and understands the difference. Clark is equal parts brilliant and derivative here. If you were to make the 5'5" Tesco assistant a woman and make the gorgeous and talented Irina a handsome and prodigal Ian, well, it's just a cliche, isn't it? But it's how Clark is able to layer on the danger. It is how she is able to blur consent. In response to him crying, Irina says, "If you weren't into it, why didn't you just say?" Clark is almost gaslighting the reader into thinking that this is your standard BDSM photo shoot. It's all normal, and one can almost hear Irina yelling at you, "What will it take for somebody to see me as a threat?" It is not a gender-flipped world at all. Irina is offered an exhibit in a London gallery, coming head-to-head with the privilege of a son of a wealthy southern businessman. Her response is poetical anger, brilliant and joyful in the torture she puts this man through. She is very much trying to smash the patriarchy, but the patriarchy isn't just men versus women. It isn't just women's rights. It is about privilege and disadvantage. It's about money, class, or being from the north and the south. But is everything that happens real? Clark demonstrates how the sexualization of young women is often why they are overlooked and not considered threats professionally as well as physically. It is morally grey at times. Actually, it's morally not very grey at all at times. This is a masterpiece, and I think it is easily one of the 10 best books written by anybody in the last decade. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Bye-bye.